The great chamber of the Galactic Concord stretched across 3 kilometers of pure crystal and light, floating in the void above the neutral world of Vathos Prime. 347 species had sent their ambassadors to this place, and today they would decide the fate of a small blue world that most of them had never heard of until this very moment. Ambassador Desik of the Varan hegemony stood at the central podium, his tall gray form casting a long shadow across the holographic display behind him. His 4 eyes gleamed with something that might have been excitement or hunger as he raised one clawed hand toward the image of a planet spinning slowly in the darkness. "Fellow members of the Concord, I present to you a world called Earth," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive hall. "It sits in a backwater spiral arm of the galaxy, far from any major trade routes or strategic positions. The dominant species calls themselves humans, and they have only recently begun sending electromagnetic signals into space." A murmur passed through the assembled aliens. The Kethrani delegation, insectoid beings with compound eyes that reflected the chamber's lights like diamonds, leaned forward with interest. The massive stone-like forms of the Drosari shifted in their seats, creating sounds like grinding mountains. The Kreth Dominion representatives, a hive-minded species that moved in perfect unison, clicked their mandibles in anticipation. "These humans have not yet achieved faster-than-light travel," Desik continued, and now his voice carried a note of contempt. "They still burn fossil fuels and fight wars among themselves over patches of dirt and outdated beliefs. They are primitive, divided, and completely unaware that they are not alone in the universe." "What do you propose we do with them?" asked the Kethrani High Speaker, her voice buzzing like 1,000 wings. Desik smiled, though on his face it looked more like a predator baring its teeth. "I propose we classify Earth under Harvest Protocol. The humans are numerous, adaptable, and physically capable. They would make excellent workers for our mines, servants for our households, subjects for our laboratories, and entertainment for our arenas." The chamber erupted in discussion. Some voices rose in support while others questioned the ethics of such a decision. But Desik had prepared for this moment for a long time, and he knew exactly which strings to pull. "The Varan hegemony will share all resources extracted from Earth with any species that supports this measure," he declared. "Furthermore, human slaves will be distributed fairly among all member worlds. Think of what we could accomplish with billions of new workers who require nothing but basic sustenance." The Kreth Dominion was the first to voice support. Their collective mind had calculated the benefits instantly, and they saw only profit in this decision. "We stand with the Varan," their speakers announced in perfect harmony. "Humans will serve the Concord well." One by one, other species began to fall in line. The promise of free labor was too tempting for some to resist. Others were simply afraid of opposing the Varan and Kreth alliance, knowing that disagreement could make them targets in the future. A few genuinely believed that primitive species like humans were meant to serve their betters. The Kethrani High Speaker raised a limb for attention. "Perhaps we should observe them first," she suggested. "Study their culture and determine if they might be candidates for integration instead." But Desik was ready for this objection. "We have already observed them," he lied smoothly. "They are violent, irrational, and incapable of peaceful cooperation even among their own kind. Integration would be impossible and dangerous. Harvest Protocol is the only sensible option." The Drosari, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. Their voices rumbled like earthquakes, slow and deliberate. "We see no reason to object. If the humans are as primitive as you say, they will not suffer greatly from serving more advanced beings. It is the natural order of things." And so it went, species after species casting their votes in favor of humanity's enslavement. Some voted with enthusiasm, others with indifference, and a few with reluctance that they quickly suppressed. Not a single voice rose in true opposition. Not one ambassador stood up to say that this was wrong. When the final count was announced, the number glowed in the air above the podium. 347 votes in favor, 0 against. The decision was unanimous. Earth would be harvested, and its people would become the property of the Galactic Concord. Desik allowed himself a moment of triumph. This would cement the Varan hegemony's power for generations. Then it is decided, he proclaimed. The fleet will depart immediately. Within one cycle, Earth will belong to us all. Far across the galaxy, on a small blue world called Earth, humans went about their daily lives with no idea of what was coming. They argued about politics and worried about their jobs and dreamed about the stars, without knowing that the stars had already decided their fate. Children played in parks while their parents worked in offices, and old men sat on benches feeding birds while young couples walked hand in hand through city streets. None of them saw the shadows that blocked out the sun 3 days later. The Varan fleet arrived without warning, dropping out of faster-than-light travel directly above Earth's major cities. Hundreds of ships, each one larger than anything humans had ever built, filled the skies from horizon to horizon. They broadcast a single message in every human language. You are now property of the Galactic Concord. Resistance will result in annihilation. But humans did resist. How could they not? Fighter jets scrambled from bases around the world, their pilots knowing they faced impossible odds, but refusing to surrender without a fight. Missiles launched toward the alien vessels, nuclear warheads streaking through the atmosphere on trails of fire. Soldiers took up positions in the streets while civilians fled in panic or stood frozen in disbelief. None of it mattered. The alien ships had shields that deflected every weapon humanity possessed. Plasma beams cut through jets like they were made of paper. Orbital bombardments turned military bases into craters of glass and ash. In 72 hours, every organized resistance had been crushed. Commander Yara Chen, once one of humanity's finest fighter pilots, watched from a shattered bunker as transport ships descended to collect the survivors. Her plane had been destroyed in the first wave, but she had survived, crawling from the wreckage with burns covering half her body. Now she could only watch as her people were herded like cattle toward the massive vessels. "This is not over," she whispered, though no one was there to hear her. "This will never be over." But the aliens were not listening. Why would they listen to cattle? Millions of humans were loaded onto transport ships that day, packed into cargo holds with barely enough room to breathe. They were tagged and cataloged and sorted like products on an assembly line. Families were separated, lovers torn apart, children ripped from their parents' arms. The screams and cries filled the air, but the aliens processed them with cold efficiency. Behind them, Earth burned. The Varan had decided to make an example of any world that dared resist, and so they scorched entire continents. Forests that had stood for thousands of years became ash in minutes. Cities that humans had built over centuries crumbled into dust. Oceans boiled along the coastlines where orbital beams struck. As the last transport ships lifted off, carrying the surviving humans to their new lives as slaves, Ambassador Desik watched from his command vessel with satisfaction. "Note this day in the records," he told his aide. "Today, the Galactic Concord gained a new resource. The humans will serve us well." He never considered that he might be wrong. None of them did. After all, what could a primitive species do against the combined might of 347 advanced civilizations? They would learn the answer to that question soon enough, but by then it would be far too late. 40 years had passed since Earth fell, and the humans had been scattered across the galaxy like seeds thrown into a storm. They worked in the crushing depths of mining colonies and served in the grand houses of alien nobles. They fought for entertainment in blood-soaked arenas and suffered in laboratories where scientists treated them like animals. The Galactic Concord had found countless uses for their new slaves, and not once did any species stop to wonder if this had been a terrible mistake. On the acid world of Kreth 7, Commander Yara Chun hauled ore through tunnels that no alien would enter. The air burned her lungs with every breath, and the acidic dust had long ago scarred her skin beyond recognition. 40 years of this work would have broken most beings, but Yara Chun was not broken. She was waiting. The Kreth overseers barely looked at the human workers anymore. Why would they bother watching slaves who had been compliant for 4 decades? They never noticed that Yara had learned their language perfectly, listening to their conversations until she understood every word. They never realized that she had memorized the layout of every tunnel, every security checkpoint, every weakness in their systems. And they certainly never suspected that she spent her rest periods teaching other humans everything she knew. How many of us are there on this world? A young man named David asked her one night in the cramped quarters where humans were allowed to sleep. 300,000, Yara replied without hesitation. Spread across 47 mining facilities. I know the location of each one and the name of every human leader we have recruited. David stared at her with wonder in his eyes. He had been born into slavery, never knowing the earth that Yara still dreamed about. How do you know all this? He asked. Yara smiled, though the expression carried no warmth. Because I have spent 40 years building a network. Humans talk to each other, David. We pass messages through work details and supply shipments. We share information whenever we are transferred between facilities. The Kreth think we are too stupid to organize, but they have never understood us at all. Across the galaxy, on the pleasure world of Theseus, a human servant named Marcus poured wine for his Voron masters. His hands were steady and his face showed nothing but humble obedience. For 20 years, he had served the noble house of Thesic, never complaining, never causing trouble, never giving anyone reason to watch him closely. Ambassador Thesic himself had grown old in that time, his gray scales fading to white. He liked to boast to his guests about how well-trained his human servant was, pointing to Marcus as proof that the harvest protocol had been the right decision. You see how docile they become with proper handling? He would say, "This one has served my family faithfully for 2 decades. What Thesic did not know was that Marcus had been listening. Every military code spoken carelessly at dinner parties, every fleet movement discussed over drinks, every political secret shared between allies who assumed the servant was too primitive to understand. Marcus remembered everything, storing the information in a memory that had grown sharp as a blade. At night, when the household slept, Marcus would find ways to send messages. A word here, a gesture there. Information passed to other human servants, who passed it to others still. The network stretched across the Voron hegemony like invisible threads, and Marcus sat at the center of it all, collecting secrets that would one day bring this empire to its knees. On the fighting world of Kethra, the crowds roared as 2 combatants faced each other in the arena. One was a massive Kethrani warrior, his exoskeleton gleaming with ceremonial oils, his mandibles clicking with anticipation. The other was a human woman, small and scarred, armed with nothing but a crude blade. They called her the Ghost because no one knew her real name anymore, not even herself. 40 years of fighting had stripped away everything except the will to survive. She had killed more opponents than any gladiator in Kethrani history, and the crowds loved her for it. They cheered whenever she entered the arena, eager to see what bloody spectacle she would create. The Kethrani warrior charged with a screech that shook the air. His claws could tear through metal, and he moved with the speed of something born to kill. But the Ghost had fought his kind before hundreds of times. She knew every weakness in their armor, every blind spot in their vision, every predictable pattern in their attacks. She stepped aside at the last moment, her blade finding the soft joint between his head and thorax. The warrior fell without ever understanding how she had beaten him. The crowd screamed with delight, throwing tokens and flowers into the arena. But the ghost was not fighting for their entertainment anymore. She was recruiting. Every human gladiator who survived more than 10 fights received her message. Everyone who showed promise was brought into her circle. She trained them in secret, teaching them to kill not just for survival, but for purpose. "One day, we will turn these skills against our masters," she told them. "One day, this arena will run with alien blood." In the laboratories of the Dressari Collective, human subjects lay strapped to tables while massive stone beings conducted experiments on their bodies. The Dressari were fascinated by human adaptability, constantly testing the limits of what these strange creatures could endure. They modified genes and implanted devices and pushed humans to the edge of death, all in the name of scientific curiosity. A human scientist named Elena had been selected for a different purpose. The Dressari had discovered that some humans possessed exceptional intelligence, and they found it useful to have slaves who could assist with their research. Elena was allowed access to equipment and data that no other human would ever see. She used that access well. Every experiment conducted on her people was recorded and analyzed. Every piece of Dressari technology was studied and understood. Elena learned how their systems worked, where their weaknesses lay, and how their entire civilization could be dismantled from the inside. And she shared this knowledge through channels that the Dressari never suspected existed. The network grew stronger every year. Humans across the galaxy learned each other's languages and cultures, forming bonds that transcended the boundaries the aliens had placed between them. A miner on Kreth 7 could send a message to a servant on Theseus, who would pass it to a gladiator on Kethra, who would relay it to a scientist in the Dressari laboratories. Information flowed like water through cracks the aliens could not see. They learned everything about their masters. They studied alien technology until they could build it themselves. They mapped every military installation, every supply route, every command structure. They identified every leader who had voted to enslave them and noted where each one could be found. 40 years of slavery had given them time to prepare, and they had used every moment. The aliens remained blind to the danger growing beneath their feet. To them, humans were just animals that could talk, useful tools with no inner life worth considering. When a human smiled at an alien master, the alien saw submission. When a human lowered their eyes, the alien saw respect. They never imagined that the smile might hide rage or that the lowered eyes might be memorizing weaknesses. On a dead moon far from any trade route, in a cavern that appeared on no map, Yarachun stood before a gathering of human leaders. They had come from every corner of the galaxy, smuggled through routes that humans had quietly established over decades. Each one represented thousands of their kind, all waiting for the signal. A holographic display showed human population clusters across 200 worlds. Red dots marked military targets, blue dots indicated supply depots, and green dots showed communication hubs. 40 years of intelligence gathering had produced a map of the entire galaxy's vulnerabilities. "Brothers and sisters," Yara said, her voice strong despite her age. "They took everything from us. They burned our home, separated our families, and treated us like animals. They thought they had broken us. They were wrong." The leaders nodded, their eyes burning with the same fire that had never died in Yara's heart. "For 40 years we have waited, watched, and learned. We know their languages, their technology, their weaknesses. We have people in every key position across the galaxy. And now, finally, we are ready." She looked at each face in the room, seeing the same determination reflected back at her. "Tomorrow night, at the exact same moment across every world, we strike. They enslaved Earth with a unanimous vote. Let them face the consequences with unanimous force. The word went out through the network, passed from human to human across the stars. In mines and mansions, arenas and laboratories, billions of humans received the message and prepared themselves. It was time. The galaxy had never known a night like this. Across 200 worlds, at the exact same moment, humanity rose from its chains and showed the universe what it had become. On Kreth 7, Yara-chan walked calmly toward the main fuel depot while Kreth overseers passed her without a second glance. She was just another slave moving between work assignments, invisible and unimportant. But hidden beneath her tattered clothing was a detonator linked to charges that human workers had secretly placed throughout the facility over the past month. 40 years, she whispered as she reached the center of the depot. 40 years I have waited for this moment. She pressed the button. The explosion ripped through the facility with the force of a small sun. Fuel reserves that powered the Kreth mining operation across 3 continents ignited in a chain reaction that turned the night sky orange. Secondary explosions followed as fire reached storage tanks and machinery. Within minutes, half of the Kreth's industrial capacity on this world was burning. But that was only the beginning. Across all 47 mining facilities, similar explosions erupted. Human workers who had spent decades learning every weakness in the Kreth infrastructure now exploited that knowledge with devastating precision. They blew up fuel lines and collapsed tunnel supports and sabotaged equipment that could not be replaced. The Kreth overseers panicked, their hive mind connection flooding with emergency signals from every direction. They tried to restore order, tried to contain the damage, tried to understand what was happening. But humans were already moving through the chaos, seizing weapons from fallen guards and opening the doors of detention cells. David fought beside Yar as they pushed through corridors filled with smoke and screaming aliens. "This way," he shouted, pointing toward the communication center. "We need to cut their connection to the homeworld." They reached the control room just as the last Kreth operator fell. Yara's fingers flew across the console, entering code she had memorized years ago. "There," she announced with fierce satisfaction. "I have locked them out of the planetary network. They cannot call for help." Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out on every world where humans had been enslaved. On Thisnus, Marcus moved through the grand halls of House Desic with a grace that belied his years. Behind him walked a dozen human servants, each one carrying weapons they had hidden for this very night. The household guards never saw them coming because they never imagined that servants could be a threat. Ambassador Desic was hosting a dinner party when the doors burst open. He looked up in confusion to see Marcus standing there, no longer bowing, no longer humble. "What is the meaning of this?" Desic demanded, trying to sound commanding even as fear crept into his voice. "The meaning," Marcus said calmly, "is that your slaves have decided they no longer wish to be slaves. 40 years ago, you presented Earth to the Galactic Concord and proposed our enslavement. You called us primitive and violent and incapable of cooperation. Do you remember?" Desic's 4 eyes widened with dawning horror. "You cannot do this. The Concord will destroy you." Marcus smiled, and it was not the smile of a servant. "The Concord is busy right now. Every world, every species, every system is facing exactly what you are facing at this moment. There is no one coming to save you, Ambassador. There is only us, the primitive species you thought you had broken." Throughout the Varan hegemony, human servants seized control of communication arrays and defense systems. They used the military codes Marcus had collected to lock Voron commanders out of their own networks. Ships that had kept humanity enslaved suddenly found their weapons offline and their navigation systems compromised. Officers screamed orders that no one could execute. On Kethra, the gladiatorial arena had been filled with a special audience that night. The Catherine elite had gathered to watch a grand spectacle. Dozens of human gladiators fighting in a massive free-for-all. They expected blood and death and entertainment. They got something very different. The ghost stood at the center of the arena as the gates opened and her fellow gladiators emerged. But instead of attacking each other, they formed a circle facing outward. The crowd murmured in confusion as the humans raised their weapons not against each other, but toward the stands. "What is happening?" demanded the arena master. "Make them fight." But the guards who should have controlled the gladiators were already dead, killed silently by humans who had waited years for this night. The gates that kept the crowd safe suddenly opened, and armed humans poured through from tunnels beneath the arena. The ghost's voice rang out across the chaos. "For every human who died in this arena, a Kathrani will answer. For every life taken for your entertainment, justice will be delivered." The elite who had cheered human deaths now fled in terror. Some escaped into the night, but many did not. The arena that had been built to watch humans die now served a very different purpose. In the Dressari laboratories, Elena had spent days preparing for this moment. She knew exactly which systems to override and which experiments to shut down. As alarms blared throughout the facility, she moved from room to room, freeing human subjects from restraints and arming them with equipment the Dressari had foolishly left unguarded. The Dressari scientists were slow to react because they could not comprehend what was happening. Their stone bodies made them nearly indestructible, but their facilities were not. Elena's team targeted life support systems and power generators and containment fields. Within an hour, the great laboratory complex was dark and cold, its massive occupants trapped in sections they could not escape. "You studied us for 40 years, Elena told the lead scientist through a communication panel. "You learned everything about our biology, but nothing about our spirit. That was your mistake." The Galactic Concord received distress signals from everywhere at once. Emergency transmissions flooded the network, each one telling the same impossible story. The humans had risen, on every world where they had been enslaved, at the exact same moment. They had struck with coordinated precision that no primitive species should have been capable of. How had they communicated across such distances without any detectable signals? How had they planned such a massive operation without any species noticing? How had slaves who owned nothing and knew nothing managed to identify and exploit weaknesses that even the Concord's own military had missed? The answers did not matter anymore. What mattered was that ships were falling from the sky and cities were burning, and the comfortable order of the galaxy was collapsing into chaos. Yara Chun stood on the surface of Kreth 7 as the sun rose over a world that humans now controlled. She was old and scarred and tired beyond measure, but her eyes burned with a fire that 4 decades of slavery had never dimmed. A communication officer approached her with a device that showed reports from across the galaxy. "Admiral Chun," he said, using the title the human leadership had given her. "We have received confirmation from all sectors. Phase 1 is complete." "How many worlds?" she asked. 187 have been secured. The rest are still fighting, but our forces are winning everywhere. The aliens never expected anything like this. Yara nodded, allowing herself one moment of satisfaction. Of course, they did not expect it. They saw us as animals, as tools, as property. They never imagined that we were watching them the entire time, learning everything, waiting for our chance. She looked up at the stars that had once seemed so far away. Now they were full of human ships, captured vessels that had been turned against their former masters. The galaxy that had enslaved Earth was about to learn a lesson it would never forget. "Send a message to all forces," she commanded. "Phase 2 begins immediately. We are not just freeing ourselves. We are taking everything they took from us, and more. Every species that voted to enslave us will face the consequences of that choice. The message went out across the stars, and billions of humans heard it. In mines and mansions, arenas and laboratories, on ships and stations and planets, they prepared for what came next. The uprising had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. But this was not the end. This was only the beginning of humanity's answer to a vote that had been cast 40 years ago. The Galactic Concord had voted 347-0 to enslave Earth. Now they would discover what that unanimous decision would cost them. Every species, every world, every leader who had raised their hand in favor would face a humanity that had been forged in the fires of slavery into something stronger than anyone had imagined. The slaves had become conquerors. The prey had become predators. And the galaxy would never be the same again. 5 years had passed since the night humanity rose from its chains, and the galaxy had learned to fear a species it once dismissed as primitive. The human expansion war, as it came to be known, had swept across the stars like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Admiral Yar Chun stood on the Bridge of the Remembrance, a massive warship that had once belonged to the Moran hegemony. Now it served as the flagship of the human coalition fleet, leading an armada of thousands of vessels toward the heart of Kreth space. Admiral, her communications officer reported, "The Kreth High Council is requesting to negotiate." Yara did not smile. She had stopped smiling long ago. "Tell them what we told every other species that asked for mercy. Bring us the council members who voted for our enslavement, and we will discuss terms." "Not before." The officer nodded and transmitted the response. Minutes later, a reply came back. The Kreth refused. Their hive mind would not surrender individual members to alien justice. "Then we continue," Yara said. "Target their communication hubs. Once their collective mind is fragmented, they will reconsider." The human coalition had learned something terrifying during the war. They improved faster than any species in the galaxy. Every weapon used against them was captured, studied, and rebuilt better. Every tactic was analyzed, countered, and turned back on its creators. What took other civilizations centuries to develop, humans mastered in months. The aliens had created their own worst enemy. 40 years of slavery had exposed humans to technology and knowledge from hundreds of different species. They had learned engineering from the Varan, biological sciences from the Dressari, military tactics from the Kreth, and countless other skills from their various masters. Now they combined all of that knowledge in ways no single species had ever imagined. On the Kreth homeworld, orbital platforms that had defended the system for millennia fell silent. Human hackers had cracked their hive mind communication frequency and infected it with chaos. Individual Kreth, suddenly cut off from the collective, wandered in confusion while human forces descended from the sky. General David Okonkwo, who had once hauled ore through acid tunnels as a slave, now led the ground assault. "Secure the council chambers," he ordered. "Non-lethal force where possible. We need them alive for the tribunal." The Kreth soldiers fought back, but their coordinated tactics fell apart without the hive mind connection. Individual Kreth were dangerous but disorganized, and human forces pushed through their defenses with relentless efficiency. In the council chambers, David found the Kreth High Council cowering behind their guards. These were the beings who had voted to enslave humanity, who had calculated the profits from human labor without a moment's consideration for human lives. Now they faced the consequences of that calculation. "You are all under arrest," David announced. "You will be transported to face trial for crimes against humanity. Resist, and you will be subdued. Surrender, and you will be treated according to the standards of justice you denied us." One by one, the council members surrendered. What choice did they have? The species that had once been their slaves now controlled their homeworld. The Kethrani fell next. The Ghost, who had spent decades killing for their entertainment, now led the assault on their arena worlds. She gave the Kethrani elite a choice: enter the arenas themselves or face immediate execution. Many chose the arenas, hoping their combat skills would save them. They were wrong. The Dorsari Collective retreated to the Galactic Rim, their massive stone bodies too slow to escape the human fleets. Elena, the scientist who had once been their test subject, designed weapons specifically to crack their silicon-based forms. You wanted to learn the limits of human adaptability. She broadcast to them as their defenses crumbled. Now you know, there are no limits. The Voron hegemony, architects of humanity's enslavement, watched their empire collapse system by system. Ambassador Desic had died in the first uprising, killed by the servant he had never bothered to learn the name of. But his descendants still ruled from the capital world, and Marcus had very specific plans for them. Marcus had become one of the most powerful figures in the human coalition, his decades of intelligence gathering having provided the foundation for their entire war strategy. Now he sat across from the new Voron High Council, offering them terms. "Your ancestor proposed our enslavement," he said calmly. "Your species voted unanimously in favor. Your fleets burned our planet and scattered our people across the galaxy. Do you deny any of this?" The Voron councilors could not deny it. The records were clear, preserved by their own archivists. "Then you understand why you must face justice. Not revenge, justice. There is a difference, though I doubt you recognize it." The Galactic Concord convened for the first time since the uprising, but now humans sat in the Great Chamber. Not as slaves being discussed, but as conquerors demanding answers. Admiral Chun addressed the assembled representatives, her voice carrying across the vast space. 347 species voted to enslave Earth. Every single one of you. Not one voice rose in opposition. Not one hand was raised to say this was wrong. You were unanimous in your cruelty, so we will be unanimous in our response. The alien ambassadors shifted nervously. Many of their species had already fallen to human forces. The rest knew they were next. "We hereby announce the doctrine of reciprocity," Chun continued. "Whatever a species did to humans will be done to them. Those who used us for labor will provide workers for human projects. Those who made us fight for entertainment will enter the arenas themselves. Those who experimented on our bodies will become test subjects in our laboratories." A Kethrani ambassador raised a trembling limb. "This is barbarism. You cannot treat civilized species this way." Chun's eyes went cold. "Civilized? You called us primitive when you voted to enslave us. You called us animals when you worked us to death in your minds. You called us entertainment when you made us kill each other for your amusement. But now that we have won, suddenly you discover civilization?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to something almost gentle. "We learned everything about civilization from you. We learned that the strong do as they will and the weak suffer what they must. We learned that mercy is weakness and compassion is foolishness. We learned that the only law that matters is power. You were our teachers. Be proud of your students." The chamber fell silent. There was nothing the aliens could say. They had created the very monster they now feared. One by one, species began to surrender. They delivered their leaders for trial and accepted human occupation of their worlds. Some tried to flee to distant corners of the galaxy, but human ships were everywhere now, faster and more advanced than anything the Concord could field. The Tribunal of Humanity convened on a space station above the ruins of Earth. Here, the leaders who had voted for enslavement faced their judgment. Each one was allowed to speak in their defense, to explain their reasons, to beg for mercy. None of their explanations mattered. The vote had been unanimous. There were no innocent parties. Marcus watched the proceedings with grim satisfaction. Beside him stood the Ghost and Elena and David and hundreds of other humans who had survived the slave years. They had all lost something in those decades. Family, friends, innocence, hope. Now they watched their former masters tremble before human justice. "They are asking for the mercy they never showed us," Elena observed. "Do you think they even understand what they are asking for?" "No," Marcus replied. "Mercy is something you have to understand to receive. They never learned it because they never needed it. They were always the strong ones, always the ones in power. Now they discover that power can change hands." Admiral Chun approached them, her face showing the weariness of years of war. "The tribunal has reached verdicts for the first group of defendants. Would you like to witness the sentences?" They followed her to the judgment chamber, where alien leaders knelt in chains. The judges, all human, read the verdicts. Guilty on all counts. The sentences varied according to the doctrine of reciprocity. Mining executives would work in mines. Arena masters would fight in arenas. Scientists would become test subjects. "This is justice," Chan announced to the assembled humans. "Not revenge, but justice. They chose to treat us as property, and now they will understand what that means. They will learn the lessons they forced upon us." The sentences were carried out across the galaxy. Alien nobles who had owned human servants now served human masters. Warriors who had hunted humans for sport were hunted in turn. The roles had reversed completely, and the galaxy's former rulers experienced what they had inflicted on others. But even as humanity achieved its victory, questions began to emerge. How far would the doctrine of reciprocity go? When would justice become revenge? When would enough be enough? These questions would define the final chapter of humanity's transformation. The slaves had become masters. But what kind of masters would they choose to be? 10 years had passed since the uprising, and the galaxy had been completely transformed. Every species that had voted to enslave Earth now lived under human authority. The Galactic Concord still existed, but it served a very different purpose now. Humans sat at every position of power, and the 347 species that had once ruled the stars now answered to the very beings they had dismissed as primitive. Admiral Yara Chun, now the supreme commander of the human coalition, stood before the tribunal of humanity one final time. This was the last day of judgments, and the last defendant waited in chains before her. The defendant was ancient. His scales faded to pure white, his 4 eyes clouded with age. He had been the youngest member of the Varan High Council 50 years ago, a minor official who had raised his hand without much thought when Ambassador Desic proposed the enslavement of Earth. Now he was the last surviving member of that original council. "Do you know why you are here?" Chan asked him. The old Varan nodded slowly. "I voted to enslave your people." "I am guilty." "Yes, you are. But I want to understand something before we pass final judgment. Why did you vote as you did? What were you thinking when you raised your hand?" The Varan was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I was thinking about nothing. It was just another vote on another primitive species. We had done it before to others. It seemed normal. I never thought about what it meant for you. I never imagined you had dreams or families or hopes. You were just resources to be harvested." Chun nodded. She had heard similar answers from hundreds of alien leaders over the years. None of them had thought about what they were doing. None of them had considered that humans might be people with lives that mattered. It had all been so easy for them, raising their hands to destroy a civilization they knew nothing about. "Do you have anything else to say before judgment is passed?" The old Varan looked up at her with something that might have been acceptance in his clouded eyes. "I deserve whatever punishment you give me. I know that now. We all deserve it. What we did to your people was monstrous, and we never even recognized it as wrong. I am sorry. I know that word means nothing after all this time, but I am sorry. Chun studied him for a long moment. Around her, the other tribunal members waited for her decision. Marcus sat to her left, his face unreadable. The ghost sat to her right, her scars visible reminders of what humans had endured. David and Elena and hundreds of others filled the chamber, all waiting to see what humanity would choose. I have spent 10 years listening to apologies, Chun finally said. I have heard every excuse, every justification, every plea for mercy. Some of your kind showed genuine remorse, while others simply feared our power. But all of you, every single one, asked for something you never considered giving us: compassion. She stood and walked toward the old Voron, her footsteps echoing in the silent chamber. For 50 years, I have carried rage in my heart. When they burned Earth, I swore I would make them pay. When they worked us like animals, I promised myself that one day they would understand our suffering. When they experimented on our children and made us kill each other for sport, I dreamed of the day we would have our revenge. She stopped directly in front of the last defendant. And now that day has come. We have the power to do to you exactly what you did to us. We could work your people to death in our mines. We could make your children fight in our arenas. We could experiment on your bodies and treat you as the animals you called us. The old Voron closed his eyes, waiting for the sentence he knew he deserved. But we will not. His eyes snapped open in shock. Murmurs spread through the chamber as humans and aliens alike reacted to her words. Chun turned to address the entire assembly. I have thought about this moment for 50 years. I have imagined it in 1,000 different ways. But as I stand here now, I realize that the choice before us is not about them. It is about us. What kind of species do we want to be? What do we want humanity to become? She looked at Marcus, who nodded slowly. She looked at the ghost, who remained stone-faced but did not object. She looked at David and Elena and all the others who had suffered and survived. We could continue the doctrine of reciprocity until every alien has experienced what we experienced. We could make them suffer for generations, the way we suffered. We could become exactly what they were. Masters who see others as nothing more than property. Her voice grew stronger. But that is not who we are. We are not the species that votes to enslave others because it is convenient. We are not the species that treats lives as resources to be harvested. We are not the species that ignores the suffering of beings simply because they are different from us. She raised her hand, and silence fell. I hereby announce the end of the doctrine of reciprocity and the beginning of the doctrine of redemption. The aliens who enslaved us will not be destroyed or tortured. They will work to repair what they destroyed. They will help us rebuild Earth. They will serve, but they will serve with the promise of eventual freedom. The old Voron stared at her in disbelief. You would show us mercy? After everything we did to you? Chun smiled, and there was something almost gentle in her expression. We could do to you what you did to us. We chose not to. That is the difference between us. You had a choice when you voted, and you chose cruelty. We have a choice today, and we choose to be better than you. Remember that when you tell your descendants why they serve. Remember that humanity had the power to destroy you and chose mercy instead. She turned back to the tribunal. Let the record show that the last defendant is sentenced to 10 years of service in the restoration of Earth. Upon completion of this service, he will be granted his freedom and allowed to return to his people. This will be the standard for all remaining sentences. The chamber erupted in discussion. Some humans were angry, feeling that the aliens deserved far worse. But many more nodded in agreement, understanding what Chun was trying to do. They had spent 50 years defined by what had been done to them. Now they could define themselves by what they chose to do. In the years that followed, the doctrine of redemption transformed the galaxy. Aliens who had once enslaved humans now worked alongside them to rebuild Earth. The burned continents slowly grew green again. The ruined cities rose from the ashes, rebuilt by the hands that had destroyed them. It was not forgiveness, not exactly, but it was something the galaxy had never seen before. Justice tempered with wisdom. Marcus became the first human ambassador to the rebuilt Galactic Concord. He stood in the same chamber where the vote had been cast 50 years before, now transformed into a museum dedicated to remembering what had happened. A plaque hung where the voting display had once been, bearing words that would be taught to children across the galaxy for generations to come. They voted 347-0 to enslave a world. They never imagined the world would remember. We remember. We forgive. We will not forget. The ghost returned to Kethra, but not as a conqueror. She established schools where humans and Kethrani children learned together, studying the history of what had happened so that it would never happen again. The arenas still stood, preserved as memorials to those who had died, but no blood was ever spilled there again. Elena created a new scientific institute where researchers from all species worked together. The experiments conducted there sought to help, not harm. The knowledge gained was shared freely. The labs that had once been places of horror became places of hope. David returned to the mines of Kreth 7, but this time as an architect of change. He designed new technologies that made the brutal labor unnecessary. Machines did the dangerous work, while beings of all species cooperated to build a better future. And Yara Chan, the pilot who had survived the fall of Earth and led humanity through slavery to freedom, finally laid down her burden. She retired to a small house on the restored coast of the continent that had once been called Africa. There she watched the sun set over blue waters and green forests that her people and their former enemies had brought back to life together. One evening, a young Varan child approached her, one of the new generation born after the war. "Is it true that your people once hated mine?" the child asked. Chun looked at the little alien with eyes that had seen so much pain and so much healing. "Yes, it is true. Your ancestors did terrible things to mine, and mine did terrible things in return. But that was a long time ago. Now we are building something new together." "Why?" the child asked. "Why did you not just destroy us when you won?" Chun smiled and looked up at the stars that had witnessed humanity's fall and rise. "Because destroying you would have made us just like you were. We wanted to be better. We wanted to show the galaxy that strength does not have to mean cruelty. We wanted to prove that even after everything, humans could choose kindness over revenge." The child thought about this for a moment. "I am glad you chose kindness." "So am I," Chun said softly. "So am I." Above them, the stars shone peacefully over a galaxy that had finally learned what humanity had known all along. The true strength was not the power to destroy, but the wisdom to rebuild. The species that had been dismissed as primitive had taught the cosmos something it had never understood before. They had shown that mercy, not vengeance, was the ultimate victory. And the galaxy would never forget the lesson.